Go live. Hello, everyone. I'm Sneha Roy. I welcome you all to Stories of Women's Identity and Social Control under TMY's Reviews December 2021 project in association with Oxford University Press. We are seeking submissions in the form of stories, poems, essays as a part of this project. To know more, please visit www.tellmeyourstory.biz. The topic of our digital conversation today is an important one, that is, marital rape, ground reality, public policy, and the way forward. In this panel discussion, we attempt at probing deeper into ground reality of marital rape as it is throughout the world, many limitations of the laws that exist and the reason for the lack of criminalization, as has been the case in many countries too. And how do we envision a path forward? And we have the privilege to have amongst us Professor Jill Elaine Hasday, Professor Saumya Uma, and Mythreyee Ramesh, who through their years of involvement in this field are experts in this field of discussion. Before moving on to hear and engage speakers, I would like to quickly introduce them. Jill Elaine Hasday is a distinguished McKnight University professor and the Centennial Professor of Law at the University of Minnesota Law School. She has written two books, Family Law Region, which was published by Harvard University Press in 2000. She has also written the book Intimate Lies Law, which was published by Oxford University Press in 19. It won the Scribes Book Award for the best work of legal scholarship published during the previous year. Saumya Uma is a professor of law, the director of Center of Women's Rights at Jindal Global Law, OP Jindal Global University, India. She has over 27 years combined experience as an academic, legal practitioner, researcher, writer, trainer, campaigner, consultant, working at the intersection of gender, human rights, and the law. Mythreyee Ramesh is a multimedia journalist who covers the gender beat for The Quint. She writes on to women, LGBTQIA community, among many other things. For the last 18 months, Mythree's focus has been reporting on how the COVID-19 pandemic has affected women and sexual minorities. On behalf of MYS Review, I welcome you all, dear speakers. And with this series of short introductions, I would like to first welcome Professor Hasday to step up forward and present her views on today's topic of discussion. Over to you, ma'am.
Okay. Thanks very much for having me. I'm delighted to be here. In my time today, I thought I would provide a brief overview of the law regulating marital rape in the United States and how it's developed over time. At common law, a husband was absolutely immune from prosecution for raping his wife. In fact, rape was defined as a crime that a man committed on a woman other than his wife. The marital rape exemption was baked into the definition of rape. The classic explanation for why prosecution for marital rape was impossible came from Lord Hale, who wrote an extraordinarily influential treatise called History of the Pleas of the Crown. It was published in England in 1736 and immediately became extremely influential both in England and in the United States. One question I have actually is, what influence did that book have in India? In thinking about the influence of this treatise, one thing to keep in mind is this is an era when lawyers don't have access to libraries, much less the internet, so they're relying on very few books to tell them everything they need to know about the law. And these treatises that purport to give complete accounts of the common law, like Hale or Blackstone, are extraordinarily influential. Hale's basic argument defending the marital rape exception was what I called an argument from irrevocable consent. In other words, that a woman had agreed to get married, and that agreement constituted permanent consent to have sex with her husband that she could not take away. That explanation for the marital rape exemption is repeated in hundreds, thousands of other treatises. It all trickles down from Hale. Many people assume that the marital rape exemption, meaning the idea that marital rape isn't a crime, was contested in the United States only relatively recently, maybe starting in the 1970s when the modern women's rights movement gets off the ground. But in fact, from the first days of organized women's rights activity in the United States, women are contesting and complaining about this marital rape exception. So the first organized women's rights convention in the United States meets in Seneca Falls in 1848. And even in their initial declaration of sentiments, they're already talking about a woman's right to herself and her own person, which is a way, sort of a coded way in the 19th century of talking about a woman's right of sexual self-ownership. And many of the leading advocates of the 19th century women's movement in the United States actually identify establishing marital rape as a crime as the most important thing they can do. And they'll say things like, what is the vote if a woman can't control her body? Usually in the 19th century, they actually don't focus on bodily autonomy as much as really the right to control how many children you have. And if a husband can force you to have sex, he can force you to have endless children in a situation where childbearing is very dangerous and child rearing is very, arduous. Okay, so 19th century feminists in the United States are very vigorously contesting the marital rape exception, but they have basically no success in changing the criminal law. The criminal law remains firm in defining marital rape as a crime that a man commits against someone who's not his wife. The only success you see in the 19th century from women's rights crusaders is they make some reforms in the law governing divorce. So increasing numbers of states are willing to say that it's not desertion for a woman to refuse to have sex with her husband. In other words, a man can't get a divorce. At least about half the states say just because a woman refuses to have sex with him. Although keep in mind, he can just force her to have sex and it wouldn't be a crime. But if she refuses and he's not willing to force the issue, he can't get a divorce. And some courts are willing to say that it counts as cruelty entitling a woman to a divorce if a husband makes particularly brutal and unreasonable demands for sex, and she has an especially good reason for refusing, which is usually that another pregnancy would jeopardize her health or, threaten her life. So there's modest changes in divorce law, but criminal law remains absolutely refusing to recognize marital rape as a crime. Starting in the 1970s in the United States, you see a resurgence of mass mobilization in support of feminism. Once again, marital rape exemptions are immediately in their sights. And here, feminists have more success. So let's say as of 1970, every state has an absolute marital rape exception. Marital rape absolutely is not a crime. Now, every states that retain a marital exemption have what I call a modified exemption. So they still treat marital rape more leniently, but marital rape can be a crime in every state in some circumstances. Usually the penalties for marital rape are less. So if for rape, it would be 20 years. For marital rape, it could be 2 years. There's extra procedural hurdles, like you have to report within 30 days. So there's ways in which it's harder to pursue marital rape and it's punished less leniently, but it can be a crime. Feminists have tried for decades now to get rid of the remaining modified marital rape exemptions, but it's just been extraordinarily hard. When I first surveyed every state, so most criminal law in the United States is through the states, so it actually can be quite difficult to find out what's going on. So when I first surveyed every state's law on marital rape in 2000, 26 states, so 26 out of 50, slightly more than half, still had marital rape exceptions, meaning they still treated marital rape more leniently, even though marital rape could be a crime. Today, I just ran the survey again, there's still 21 states with some form of marital rape exception. So only 5 states have gotten rid of marital rape exceptions in the last 21 years. So very slow progress, despite a lot of efforts. Just extraordinary resistance to getting rid of marital rape exceptions. In fact, some states have actually expanded their marital rape exceptions beyond the common law baseline. So at common law, marital rape exceptions are just about marriage. They click in when you get married and they end when you get divorced, which in that era is very difficult. You have to have a cause, you have to have fault, you have to show fault, and it's very hard to prove. Some states have actually expanded marital rape exceptions. So now not only do they treat marital rape more leniently, but they also treat rape more leniently when it occurs between unmarried people who live together. So that's actually an expansion. So in that sense, it's actually gotten worse over time. Just this is kind of a little bit inside information, but why does the marital rape exception survive? Because American constitutional law makes it very hard to challenge as sex discrimination statutes that are facially neutral, which is on their face, they don't speak about men versus women. So remember, I said at common law, rape is defined as a crime a man commits against a woman, not his wife. When states modify their marital rape exception, so when they set up, here's the rules for rape, and here's the more arduous rules for marital rape, or here's the lesser penalties for marital rape, they also rewrote their marital rape exceptions in facially neutral terms. So they now speak of one spouse or raping your spouse. The available evidence suggests that this is a crime overwhelmingly committed by men. Like at one point, I looked for every possible. To my knowledge, there's never been a situation of a woman raping her husband that's come to the attention of law enforcement. There's a handful of cases, like maybe 5 in the psychiatric literature, but it's just vanishingly small. So but despite the fact that this is overwhelmingly, in heterosexual marriages at least, a crime that men commit against women, for purposes of US constitutional law, once they rewrote those statutes as sex neutral, so they speak about lesser penalties for raping your spouse, it's extraordinarily hard to challenge it as sex discrimination, as unconstitutional sex discrimination. You basically have to prove that the legislature passed this specifically because they wanted to hurt women, and proving that kind of malice is just very difficult. Okay, so we have, so the first agenda item, I would say, in the United States is to get rid of the remaining marital rape exceptions, which has proven to be very slow going. Second thing I want to say is that even if on the books, the law in every state treated marital rape the same as rape outside of marriage, which is, I think, where the law should go, there still would be a lot of issues to keep in mind. So for instance, I think it's still likely that prosecutors would be much more reluctant to bring these cases, and juries might be much more reluctant to convict. There's a very interesting study that was done in California after it switched from an absolute marital rape exception to a modified marital rape exception, where marital rape was a crime, but there was lesser penalties. And it found that the conviction rate for marital rape was actually higher than the conviction rate for non-marital rape. But why was that? It was because prosecutors only pursued marital rape cases in very extraordinary situations. Basically, there was like a third-party witness, which, as you can imagine, is very rare that there's a third party witnessing the marital rape. So yeah, if they actually found a case they were willing to take, the jury convicted because it was overwhelming. It was like it happened by the side of the road. There were people watching, but prosecutors seemed unwilling to bring marital rape cases outside of these extraordinary sort of slam dunk cases. So I think it's a mistake to think that simply treating marital rape the same as rape outside of marriage on the books is enough to solve the problem. I think that's a very important first step, and it's going to take, at the rate we're going, it's going to take us, the US, a century more to get there. But I don't think it solves the problem. Anyway, so I'm interested in hearing more about what's happening in India, and if there are interesting comparisons and contrasts to be made. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you so much, Professor Hasday. I think it was a really enlightening talk, and I'm sure that Professor Uma will definitely have a lot to tell us about the Indian or the South Asian context. So next, I would like to welcome Professor Uma. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you, Sneha. I hope you're able to hear me.
Yes, ma'am. You're very audible.
Yeah, sure. Okay. So I will just take the conversation forward from where Professor Jill Hasday left it. And I find very interesting parallels between what she has explained about the American experience. Of course, from whatever she has told us, US is at another level where, they have had the marital rape exceptions removed in a lot of the statutes. But in South Asia, that is still not done. And we are still fighting at that level itself. I want to quickly say what is the situation in the South Asian countries, and then um, move on to look at some of the discourses around marital rape in South Asian countries. So, as far as Bangladesh is concerned, it's been marital rape is partially criminalized. So, it's criminalized when it is children who have been married, and there is a rape committed on them. There's also a lower punishment for marital rape than for non-marital rape. And in October 2020, there was a case of a 14-year-old girl who died of genital bleeding a month after her marriage. And the High Court has been petitioned, challenging the discriminatory marital rape exception to be violative of women's fundamental rights. So the case is pending before a high court in Bangladesh. As far as India is concerned, it has not criminalized marital rape when it concerns women over 18 years of age. There is a very specific exception in the rape provision in the penal code. There is an exception when it comes to marital rape, but the Domestic Violence Act includes sexual violence. It is also there in the matrimonial statute. So, but those are not criminal law remedies, but those other remedies do exist. In Nepal, it has been explicitly criminalized. Marital rape is criminalized, but there is a discriminatory sentencing policy between marital and non-marital rape. In Pakistan, marital rape has been included in the definition of rape in 2006, but the socio-cultural context overrides this legal provision. And from 2006 till now, there has only been one criminal complaint filed, despite an overwhelming evidence of prevalence of marital rape. In Sri Lanka, marital rape is recognized as a criminal offense only when the couple has judicially separated through the court, or where the girl is under 16 years of age. And the Domestic Violence Act of Sri Lanka, enacted in 2005, does not even include sexual violence. So, as we can see, I mean, a summary of it in terms of the law in South Asia is, some countries have criminalized marital rape, many countries have not. But even those countries which have criminalized, they have a discriminatory sentencing policy, and implementation is still a very big question because of the socio-cultural context, where it becomes very, very challenging for a woman to actually file a criminal complaint of marital rape. Now, I want to try and address a couple of questions. My first question, which I'm asking to myself, is why is marital rape treated differently from other forms of rape? Rape is rape, so should all forms of rape not be treated the same? So I'm going back to what our first speaker spoke about, the treatises on common law and their influence. Of course, in the South Asian context, because of colonialism, all that common law has influenced much of the law that exists right now. So one of the reasons why marital rape is treated differently is because of a common law doctrine called doctrine of coverture. And through this doctrine, husband and wife become merged in their identities after marriage, and they become one flesh. That is what is called. And wife completely loses her identity and autonomy over her body, while the husband has control over her properties as well as her person. So this doctrine of coverture came to be introduced in the South Asian countries as well. Now, within that legal framework, husband was deemed to be incapable of raping his wife, as he owned her body, he owned her chastity, he owned her fidelity, She had absolutely no sexual autonomy or bodily integrity whatsoever against her husband. Um, the doctrine of coverture has shaped, informed, influenced the laws in South Asia in many ways. It has influenced, for example, the criminal law on adultery. It has resulted in a matrimonial remedy called restitution of conjugal rights, where the wife can be forced to return to the company of her husband. It has resulted in a matrimonial practice of an aggrieved husband claiming damages from the adulterer for violating his right to his wife's person. So, almost treating his wife like a chattel. And this provision in India, at least, it existed in the statute books till perhaps a decade ago. And of course, non recognition of marital rape is part of this entire scheme of how the doctrine of coverture has really influenced the criminal law. Over a period of time, it became all about marriage as a social contract where a wife is said to have, there is an implied consent on the part of the wife to give up her bodily autonomy in exchange for protection. And this consent is believed to be irrevocable and complete. And this is a notion that upon marriage, woman has given unconditional, unequivocal consent to her husband to have sex with her. It is like a free license to him, and her specific consent at each instance then becomes irrelevant. During the COVID-19 pandemic, although there was a high prevalence of domestic violence, which was considered a shadow pandemic, but because marital rape has either not been recognized in as a criminal offense in many of the South Asian countries, or even where it's recognized, there's so much of a socio-cultural challenge that women face. So there's little data to tell us about the prevalence of marital rape during the lockdown itself. Now, very quickly, I want to list what are the why advocate recognition of marital rape as a criminal offense. Um, the main thing for us is to withdraw this exception to marital rape. So we have a penal provision which talks about rape. Rape as criminal is criminalized, but there is an exception when it comes to marital rape. So the idea is to remove that exception, because if that exception is not removed, it is signaling that husbands have unlimited, unrestricted access to the wife's person. And this is a demand which has come up by the women's movements in South Asia, in successive debates for law reform initiatives. And of course, there's no unanimous position among feminists, because there are some feminists who think that criminalizing a marital rape may strengthen the arm of the state without really providing any real redress for women. And other feminists also argue that desirability is there, they question the desirability of privileging rape within a range of violence, sexual and non sexual, that happens within a marital relationship. Why privilege only rape? And they question the heteropatriarchal nature of the institution of marriage itself. So, in that sense, there is no unanimous position among feminists. But I think the focus has really been to remove this exception to marital rape and treat all rape as rape, instead of privileging the husbands because of this unique nature of a marital relationship. Of course, the other arguments are also to do with CEDAW. They are to do with the fundamental rights guaranteed by the respective constitutions, and they are also about UN Declaration on Elimination of Violence Against Women, which recognizes marital rape as a form of violence against women. Now, what are the arguments against the recognition of marital rape as a criminal offense. Firstly, the discourse in South Asia is that the sanctity of marriage and family will be violated. Secondly, there are arguments made about poverty, illiteracy, religious beliefs, as if a poor person does not know that it is wrong to rape his wife, or an illiterate person doesn't know that it is wrong to rape his wife. But these are arguments which are made. Third argument that is made is that marital rape is a Western notion and practice. It doesn't happen here. Although in South Asian countries, overwhelmingly, the statistics have shown that marital rape and intimate partner violence is prevalent across all the South Asian countries. Fourth is the social contract, which I've already talked about. So, social contract, so implied consent of the wife. And the fifth and very important reason is that wives will lie and they will make false complaints to harass the poor husbands. This is an argument which is being increasingly made by men's rights groups, and they have lobbied very successfully for a dilution of laws on domestic violence, and they argue against criminalizing marital rape as well. So, with this, I just want to end with saying what are some of the challenges in South Asia. I think the challenges can be categorized under legal, social, and political. Legal, one is the exception to marital rape, which actually has to be removed from the criminal statutes. Secondly, discriminatory sentencing, which has to be removed. A lack of effective implementation of the law, and a lack of legal awareness. So these are aspects to do with legal challenges. In terms of social challenges, we see that a lot of women in the South Asian countries have actually internalized acceptance of marital rape. And it is also normalized as a form of violence among the men. So that is a huge challenge. And political challenge is the lack of political will and a lack of political consensus to criminalize or address marital rape through public awareness, announcements, passing a clear message, and so on. I will just end by saying that marital rape, in my opinion, marital rape is a manifestation of patriarchy. While we are working at bringing about legal and social changes, I think it's an important aspect of the feminist project to strike at the root cause, which is the patriarchal beliefs and the patriarchal actions. Thank you, and I look forward to hearing the other speakers.
Thank you so much, Professor Uma, for that extremely stimulating conversation. And I think that you have raised extremely salient points on what all comprises the many challenges when it comes to criminalizing marital rape. And I'm sure that we also would have a lot of insights for us, what kinds of experiences she has had when it comes to reporting on these issues and the many journalistic aspects related to marital rape. So next, I would like to welcome Mythreyee Ramesh, present her opinions and insights on the topic. To you.
Yeah, thank you, Sneha, for having me here, and thank you for this opportunity to talk about marital rape. This is a topic that has been a part of my conversations, has been a part of the stories I tell as the gender reporter. Now, I just want to start off, also saying that there we have had far more qualified and seasoned panelists talk to us about the policies and the laws that need like urgent attention, and I would like to limit myself and sort of talk about one point that Dr. Uma mentioned about how women have internalized and how we have normalized and accepted even something that is marital rape. So to just give like a delve into a little bit of statistics, at least 1 in 3 women in India between the ages of 16 to 45 have said that at some point in their marriage they have faced some sort of physical or sexual violence by their intimate partners. Now, this could be domestic violence, this could be emotional violence, this could be any form of violence, and it could also be marital rape. Now I would just like to, like, all the listeners over here who are listening, to take a moment and to sort of also think, when was the last time we spoke to someone about domestic violence? When was the last time you spoke to your partner about domestic violence? When was the last time you had a conversation with, say, any of your family members, with your friends, with your colleagues? And I'm sure, like, most of the people who are listening here would have had some instance where, they have discussed this in the recent past. But then, how many of us also discuss marital rape within our social circles? When was the last time we discussed it with somebody who is, our partner, maybe an intimate partner, somebody who is even our friend, somebody who's a colleague? So, this is a topic that barely gets any sort of attention in India, at least. So, domestic violence has become a part of mainstream conversation now, because activists, feminists, women, and all stakeholders have been talking about it for a few years now. And the first step that I would like to, like, say here is for all of us who are like stakeholders in this to have a conversation about it and to sort of bring it to a mainstream conversation, because only then will we be able to break this internalized patriarchy that we have all sort of, like, consider that marital rape is something that is okay. Now, I would like to share my experience during the COVID-19 pandemic. Like Dr. Uma mentioned, we saw an alarming number of cases of violence, where, like, domestic violence, where almost all perpetrators and, like, the survivors were locked without any outlet. So at this time I had done a story about the shadow pandemic, and I had a very interesting call with this person who reached out to me. And I would like to call her Anita, and let's say she is from Bangalore, which is an urban city in India. And she is an architect who is working at a well known firm in the city. Now, she called me, and the first thing that she said to me was, my husband is a very nice person. I don't really have anything to say about him. He's not really abusive, she says. And then she says, but off late, during the pandemic and during the lockdown, it could be because of the lockdown that he is forcing himself upon me every day. And what do you think I should do so that I do not feel weird? You see, the problem here, she was putting the onus on herself. This is an educated, upper caste woman who is really privileged enough to also and she would, to certain extent, even know what is happening to her. But this whole, like, sense of shame in admitting to have a conversation about it, and where she's almost internalized and normalized, and now she is looking at herself and thinking that what should I do so that I do not feel this way. And now, in a complete contrast of her, is somebody I met when I was on one of my reporting trips to Rajasthan a couple of years ago. This was somebody who was married at the age of 14. She started living with her husband when she was 18. And within a span of 4 years, she has had 3 kids. And now, when she is in that situation where, her husband comes home drunk every night. It might sound very stereotypical, but this is her life, where he comes home drunk every night, he beats her up, and then he forces himself upon her. Now, she knows what is happening to her is wrong, but she talks to other people, she talks to the NGOs who are working with her about domestic violence, but she is very, very hesitant to talk about marital rape. Now, we have two different contrasts of people who are coming from two different, like, social backgrounds, who think that what is happening to them, who know what is happening to them is not okay, but then they are failing and they are not, like, willing to sort of address it. Now, at some point, I just want women to stop blaming themselves and to also know that what is happening to them is not their fault. They are not the ones who are not doing enough to sort of make this happen. So I think that is a very important conversation we should have. We should somehow, all of us here should make marital rape a part of mainstream discourse. This should not be something that we discuss because one high court judge makes a statement, and then like we outrage about it on social media platforms and then really stop talking about it. That is not how this conversation is going to go forward. That is not how we are going to sort of break this whole like internalizing by women who think that anything that is happening is their fault. So at some point women should speak up, because I nobody else is going to speak out for them, and they should be told that the onus of what they are going through is most definitely not on them, and that we should also tell them a no means no, whether this man is your husband or not. And that is something that is very important, and we should start seeing rape as not a threat to someone's honor, not a threat to someone's family, but as an attack on the person's individual self, and as an attack on her personhood, on as an attack on her body. And it is only when women start breaking this whole idea of what marital rape is, will I think we will move forward. And a lot of onus also lies on media to sort of pursue these stories and tell these stories, and as more people read and more people have conversations, which is really really important, and that is when we are actually going to see like some change at even at the law, or even at the policy level. So yeah, that's all I had to say.
Thank you so much, Dee, for that extremely heartwarming conversation, which puts perspective with how things have been in the grounded reality of things. And I think that really helps us have a more wholesome perspective into things. We are not just talking about the legal aspect of things, but we are also trying to look at how it has been for people in real day-to-day lives. And I think with this, we can slowly proceed on forward to the question answer segment, where we will be able to, indulge with the many aspects and changes of criminalizing marital rape in India, and the many aspects, what has the situation been like even in those countries it has been criminalized. So the first question, I think, would be about this, that we are all aware that, in 2013, a UN committee had recommended that the Indian government criminalize marital rape. And so did the J.S. Verma committee set up in the aftermath of the Nirbhaya protests. So, with marital rape having been criminalized in 100 countries, I would like you all to deliberate on what you think makes India find it difficult to criminalize marital rape. Why is there this need to not interfere excessively in marital relationships, as the Law Commission in its 162nd report exactly quoted in their own report? What do you think goes into this complicated situation in India?
I could set the ball rolling, and maybe other
Sure, ma'am.
speakers could. Yeah. So when Justice Verma committee that you mentioned, Sneha. So Justice Verma committee in 2012 observed, there were many very good observations. The committee observed that exception for marital rape stems from a long outdated notion of marriage, which regards wife as nothing more than property of the husband. And it explained that the wife ought not to be deemed to have consented to sexual intercourse when the rapist is the husband. And it said that a rapist remains a rapist regardless of his relationship with the victim. So these are very, very powerful words. And based on this reasoning, Justice Verma committee did recommend the inclusion of marital rape as an offense in the IPC, and it actually recommended removing that exception for marital rape. Um, but when it went in 2013, it was considered by the Parliamentary Standing Committee on Home Affairs. The standing committee said that if marital rape is brought under the law, the entire family system will be under great stress. So very often we have seen this in India, that the family has to be protected, the marriage has to be protected, even if that is at the cost of the woman, at the cost of woman's right to dignity, to her bodily autonomy, to sexual integrity. It doesn't matter. It is the family, the institutions of marriage and institutions of family that have to be protected. So we see the same kind of argument which the Parliamentary Standing Committee on Home Affairs made in 2013. In 2016, the Union Minister for Women and Child Development, she observed it was a very shocking observation, and she said that we can't have a law against marital rape in India because marriage is a sacrament, and we have poverty, illiteracy, religious beliefs, and so we cannot have a law against marital rape. So what does poverty and illiteracy have to do with with outlawing marital rape or criminalizing marital rape is something that probably only the union minister would know. And if there are religious beliefs that actually allow or advocate for the wife to be raped by the husband, I think those kind of religious beliefs have to be questioned, because the Indian constitution does provide for fundamental right to equality and non-discrimination for women. But this was the kind of argument that was advanced in 2016 by the Union Minister for Women and Child Development. So the other reason why it has been so difficult to remove this marital rape exception is also because of the men's rights lobbies, who are saying that if we remove this exception, every wife is going to file a criminal complaint against her husband. It will be a false complaint, just to drag the husband to the court, just to teach the husbands a lesson. And this is a kind of lobby that has led to somewhat of a dilution of section 498A, which is a criminal law provision on domestic violence. So these have been, and apart from this, of course, the internalized patriarchy that I was mentioning earlier, and which Mythreyee also talked about, that is another aspect which makes it so difficult, because it's difficult for women to come out and say or give a criminal complaint against their husbands for marital rape. But if this fear is to be looked at, this fear that every married woman is going to run to the nearest police station and immediately file a false criminal complaint against her husband. If we actually look at the Pakistan situation, we see that there's only been one criminal complaint which has been filed, even though marital rape has been included in the definition of rape from 2006. So we see that the socio-cultural context is still going to be a major challenge, even if the marital rape exception to rape is removed. So those are the challenges that I would like to highlight.
One thing I could add is that as I was listening to Professor Uma's talk, so many of the arguments are not unique. They said exactly the same thing, and they still say exactly the same thing in the United States. So I call it the vindictive wife argument. Women will file false charges. There's absolutely no evidence that this is a problem. They're more likely to file false charges here with any other crime, that it's a threat to marital harmony. On that account, of course, like, what threatens marital harmony? It's not the fact that he raped her, it's that she brought charges. But that it's marriage is like the sacred space that the law shouldn't enter, which again is denying that the law, regardless of what the law is setting the terms of marriage. Now the law is setting the terms of marriage if you can rape your wife. It's not like the law's not there. The law's there, but it's on the rapist's side. But every argument, except I haven't heard the like a literacy poverty argument. You don't hear that one in the US, but everything else, I was like, oh, I could have said all the same things. You know, every single argument is the same, and it's striking. Also on the child marriage, so that's not as, I think actually there's more under 18 marriages than you would think in the US, but it's not as salient a political issue. But there have been cases where a man is being prosecuted for raping an underage girl, and the prosecutor will say, if you marry her, we'll drop the charges. So that's like retrospective. I mean, it's terrible. But I think it turns out that I feel like sexual prerogatives in marriage are considered like the core of what husbands deserve. And that's like the last thing to change. Yeah, I think just there's been much, at least in the US, it's been easier to change other aspects of the standard coverture rules governing marriage. Like it was easier to change the property rules, but this is like the core. And at least in the US, there's very few people who are willing to go on the news and defend the marital rape exception. It's just legislatures won't change it. So it's not like someone is like happy to debate me. No one will debate me, but they won't actually change it. So it can be very hard because a lot of times, at least in the US, they don't want to present their arguments because their arguments are terrible. So they just don't do it.
Thank you so much, Uma and Professor Hasday. And I think the basic point which we always get to is this, that despite the number of increasing number of cases that have been happening throughout the country, it makes us wonder, what is it that makes our systems or our institutions keep on giving credibility to such kinds of accusations, that false cases might the very fear of false cases could be something on which we could frame our legal frame our entire legal structure. Because all the more flabbergasting when we think about the fact that in most of the countries, what we see is whole structure is already patriarchal. And then we also get to see that even when we think of people who are in positions of power, even in legal structures, the same kind of structure, the same kind of being replicated there too. And I think that also has got a lot to account for why is it that we are finding it so difficult to criminalize marital rape despite it being a crime in senses of the term. And I think it brings us to our next question. That is, it stems forth from Professor Uma's bringing forth the point that this criminalization of marital rape might create a collapse of the social and our family systems. There is this that it might do so. So what makes us ponder on that, ironically, such a statement makes us doubt the very foundation on which our social and family systems are built. If we are thinking that it such foundations that we have to build our structures of family and structures of nations on. So is this fear limited solely to the Indian context, or can we say that the same fear can be seen in other countries too, according to observation and insights?
I think this idea that it's dangerous to have the state come in and give one spouse a claim against the other, you see in many contexts. But I think that's another. What's the fear with marital rape? Again, what disrupts it is not the act of violence and the act of rape; it's the complaint. And I think the idea is, so what's supposed to happen is, just to go sort of what you were saying in terms of journalism, the idea is there's this model penal code, which is like guidance for criminal law in the US. And one of their comments said, we don't want the law to intervene in the ongoing process of adjustment. So who's being adjusted? It's clearly the wife who's supposed to get used to it, right? Because if she doesn't get used to it, she's just going to get a divorce. Like, it's over anyway. But the idea is that the reason the law is not intervening is precisely because women are expected to get used to it. And in fact, they do, right? Most people take their cues not from the laws on the books, but they take it from the society they live in. And if in fact women get used to it, like surveys in the US suggest that 1 in 7 or 1 in 8 women have been victims of marital rape. So plenty of women have gotten used to it. And that's what the law is assuming, because otherwise their arguments don't make sense.
Thank you so much, Professor Hasday. I think we can therefore move on to the next question based on your answer. That is, in the West, we see that mostly criminalization has occurred by the removal of the exemptions from the general law by legislation or by the courts striking down these exemptions as unconstitutional. And we also see that some states have created a distinct crime of spousal rape. Certain countries have also done so. So, is it enough to simply remove the exemption from the general rape law that, a man is exempt from charges if it happens to be his wife? And how do you think it's different from having a separate rape law on spousal rape? If it would be great, you could, illuminate
Okay.
all the more on how these two things are different.
I think it's better if it's just part of regular rape law, because the reason they have a separate crime of spousal rape is because they want to treat it differently. They want to have lower penalties. A lot of times, like, they'll define sexual assault, like the worst is with a gun or with like a knife, and then it goes down, and they'll make marital rape only a crime at the top, like only if it involves a gun or a deadly weapon. So the reason for having spousal rape as a separate thing is always to treat it more leniently. So I don't think that's a good strategy. The perfect law would be a law that treats it the same and actually has a subheading that says whether, it's a crime whether or not you're married, whether or not you explicitly says whether or not you're in a relationship, sort of primes it. But as I was saying in my initial remarks, getting the law on the books is in getting rid of marital rape being differentiated is this enormous victory, and I don't want to diminish it, but it's really the first step, because you have to get prosecutors willing to pursue it. You have to get women willing to go forward. Why should women go forward if prosecutors aren't really going to pursue it? You don't want to be beat up by the criminal justice system. So it's just the first step. But I think the campaign for changing the criminal law can be this opportunity, like, to have news stories. Because the thing about marital rape is it's all the time, it's constant. So how do you have that news hook to get it in the news? Well, a campaign to change the law could also be this education moment where you also talk about why marital rape is bad and why women shouldn't tolerate it. And, it can be this moment of activism, because changing the law isn't going to be enough. You have to change people's minds.
Thank you so
I
much,
just want
Professor
to.
Hasday.
Can I
Yes,
just
sure.
add
Carry
to
on.
because
Yes, ma'am.
one of the things that Professor Hasday was saying is how, even if one were to just remove this criminal law, this marital rape exemption, that itself is not enough. I'm also thinking, let's assume in India we actually managed to get the marital rape exception removed. Okay, that itself is going to be a Herculean task. It has not happened in the last 10 years, 12 years, but we can keep trying. Let's assume that is removed. Does that guarantee that women will be encouraged to go and file a criminal complaint at a police station? What happens when a woman goes to a police station filing a complaint of rape by a stranger, rape by an acquaintance, rape by somebody who's not her spouse? Even then, women have such a rough time, right? The police sneers, the police delay filing the FIR. After it is filed, investigation is done in a shoddy manner. After investigation, when it goes for prosecution, prosecutor is not committed enough to this kind of trial. The rape trial itself becomes voyeuristic. It becomes more of a character assassination on the woman. Okay, we are facing all of this. Now imagine if a woman goes to the court saying that I've been raped by my husband. She is probably her character assassination in terms of whether she has been a good wife. That will come up in court. Have you been a good woman? Have you been a good wife? It's not about what the man has done. It's always about the woman's character, the woman having to prove her innocence rather than the man's guilt being proven. So I think that along with removing the marital rape exemption, I think the criminal legal system in India needs a major overhaul. And if that doesn't happen, if it doesn't become women friendly, if it doesn't become victim friendly, and if it continues to be this embedded patriarchy, embedded institutional patriarchy that exists, then I think that women are not going to be encouraged to approach a police station and file a criminal complaint anyway. But it is still important to remove this exception, because this exception is giving the message that every husband has a license to rape his wife, and that will have no legal consequences, no criminal law consequences, and the criminal law will sit and be a mute spectator and do nothing about it. So, if not for anything else, at least for that sake, we must continue the campaign to remove that marital rape exemption from criminal law.
I totally agree. You have to get rid of it, even if its practical consequences aren't going to be clear for years, because otherwise the symbol is terrible.
Yeah, yeah.
Thank you so much, professors, for your brilliant answers. And I think this puts us into better perspective into what would be the situation be like, even if there is criminalization of marital rape in India or in the other countries where it has not yet been criminalized. And I think this brings us to the last question of today's discussion. That is, in building momentum for the criminalization of marital rape, how can we better envision a counterculture which takes away or can take away years of conditioning, which holds sacrosanct toxic ideals of marriage to assume an irrevocable license to assert power, brutality, and control over women's bodies? What do you think we can do from our ends as members of society towards trying to harbor change in this entire situation of how we think of marriage in general and how we think of marriage as a relationship between men and women, or even between people belonging to different sexualities, or between different gender, from to any area of the gender spectrum?
One
I think
thing,
that,
oh, sorry.
sorry,
You go, you go, you go,
we
you go.
want to go for, okay. One thing I think that will help is we keep telling our daughters not to go out in the dark, not to be outside because she'll get raped. I think we have to start telling our sons, to not to that it is not okay to rape. Um, and I think it's about parents bringing up their sons with a tremendous level of responsibility. And it is also about having conversations with young people around issues of consent. I think that's a very, very important conversation to be had. But like I was in one of my classes recently, I was talking about consent, and one of my students told me that we don't have role models at home about how to have a loving relationship, because in the Indian culture, parents do not show their love for each other in the presence of children, and the only thing they see is then brutality. The only thing they see is violence. They don't have role models at home, and nobody talks to them openly about consent within an intimate relationship. I think, how do you unpack consent? How do you handle rejection? I think these are very, very important conversations that we must start having with young people, both of all genders. And I think that could be a starting point of changing that discourse, and actually challenging that toxic masculinity which exists right now.
I agree with all of that. I was going to say something similar, which is I think, I don't know to the extent there's sex education classes in high schools in India, but one thing they've done in the US, I think with some success, is now sex education is much more around consent and less just like, this is how you could get sexually transmitted disease, more like consent and the importance of consent. And that, I think that's really important. In the 19th century, feminists did a lot of they wrote marriage manuals, which is both for men and women. Like, what should you expect in marriage? I just think that, I know there's a lot of stigma and shame around it, but having an article in a women's magazine about this is what you should expect from marriage, I think can actually really help people, because a lot of it is about social expectations. So, and I think in particular, sex ed and obviously parents should be talking to their kids, but sex ed in schools is this opportunity. Why doesn't sex ed talk about consent? And then it has to be mutual. And if it's not, you just have to wait,
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Professor, for your answers. And I think it also makes me remember that we have this culture of marrying off victims of sexual violence to the rapist in order to somehow, create this comparative sort of marriage, which all the more in many ways legally also justifies marital rape. And it is an implicit sort of, justifying marital rape, though there is no such legal framework which, put all into perspective yet. So I think all the pointers that you have put forward are extremely important, and we need to have more conversations in our homes, in our everyday life, so that people try to be more aware of what kind of repercussions they are causing to the people around them, and the kind of ripples, the social ripples they're creating in society in general. So, thank you so much, dear speakers, for this extremely important conversation we should be having more of. And it has been a pleasure having you amongst us, contributing to this panel discussion and sparing your valuable time. Much indebted to you. And we have also come to the end of today's panel discussion. Thank you so
Thanks
much.
for having me. It was a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All our pleasure, ma'am. Thank you. Please wait.